Hello there, I'm Dr. Tyler Desplena, and this is my book, Foundations of Strongman Training. I've used my scientific training to perform brand new research studies on the sport of strongman and combined it with over a decade of personal experience competing in strongman and powerlifting to teach you how to train like the strongest people on earth. I've decided to make a video series on the content of the book. I'm going to share with you everything from how the book idea came to be to practical considerations for the insights gained from these scientific studies. By the end of this video series, you'll have the information you need to optimize your strongman training. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Foundations of Strongman Training. Today, I want to take you through some more material from Chapter 1 of the book. I would like to give you a brief history and review of the sport of strongman, and then I want to discuss 5 of the major challenges of the sport and training for the sport that I've outlined in the book. In case you missed the last episode, I did a brief review of the scientific literature around the sport, went over some of the articles, and so if you're interested in that kind of thing, I encourage you to go watch the episode. The big takeaway, though, was that none of the literature addressed those 4 fundamental questions that I posed in the book. And so we'll get to those in later episodes. But before we get there, I wanted to give you all some background and context about the sport of strongman and the challenges that the athletes face. All right, let's get into the history. So, strongman is derived from ancient feats of strength. Most of the records we have is about lifting stones. Those are the big, objects that these people had access to, at least in earlier times. And so, basically, people would lift stones to determine things like their role in society. We would use stones as a test of manhood. So, if you could lift certain stones, you're now a man in certain cultures. That's why today we often refer to certain stones as manhood stones. So that's where the sport kind of derives from. These like contests where people would gather to see who could lift the biggest stone or lift it to the highest platform, so on and so forth. If you're interested in that kind of history or and in leading up to the kind of 19th, 20th century strongman, I highly recommend reading Edmund de Bonet's book, Kings of Strength. It kind of highlights these kind of ancient feats of strength and some of the more modern ones leading up to before the conception of the modern sport of strongman. The performers of the 19th and 20th century popularized the word strongman, first of all. That's where you started to hear this used in kind of like circus type performances. And they also popularized the use of barbells and dumbbells. However, stone lifting still is a foundational aspect of the sport of strongman, with many cultures still lifting stones to this day. If you're interested in more, Rogue Fitness has really good documentaries, and also Martins Licis has some really great stuff on this, where he's traveled the world trying out all these different forms of ancient stone lifting that some people still do to this day. And that brings us to where did the modern sport begin? Many consider the modern sport of strongman to begin with the inaugural World's Strongest Man competition, which happened in 1977. Essentially, what the promoters did was bring a bunch of athletes from a bunch of different disciplines and backgrounds together to compete for this title of the World's Strongest Man. So we had people like football players, wrestlers, powerlifters, weightlifters, all coming together to see who could best each other at these different feats of strength. Now, before this, we definitely had strong men and strong women. Like I mentioned before, there was many popular circus type performers that were referred to with this title, but we didn't really have the sport. So, in honor of this contest, kind of defining the start of the sport, I thought I'd rattle off a bit of history about the sport. That way, you have some background and you can go look up any of these different athletes and time periods and kind of immerse yourself in it if you'd like. So, the first World's Strongest Man in 1977 was won by Bruce Wilhelm, who also won it the following year, 1978. And then we saw powerlifting legend Don Reinhardt come in and steal his crown in 1979. But that was just the start of powerlifters coming into the sport. Now we see a very famous legend of the sport who was a powerlifter, Bill Kazmaier, make his debut in 1980 and win the crown 3 consecutive times until 1982. Now, this sparked a great rivalry in the 80s, probably one of the best rivalries of the sport between himself, Bill Kazmaier of the United States, John Paul Sigmarsson of Iceland, and Jeff Capes of the UK. There's some awesome video footage online that I encourage you to go watch. Very entertaining, where the three of these gentlemen got into some pretty heated battles. However, and if you follow the sport, you probably agree with me that I think the promoters of World's Strongest Man in the 80s kind of shafted us, and also Bill Kazmaier, because they didn't invite him for a number of years after he won the title 3 times in a row. Now, this paved the way for John Paul Sigmarsson and Jeff Capes to become the famous strongman that they did, and also help build this rivalry. But I think we may have seen Bill win a few more titles if he was invited to the contests all those years. And that brings us to the 1990s World's Strongest Man, where we see a very dominant performance by another Icelander, Magnus Magnusson, who goes on to win the title 4 times in the 90s. I also remember a gentleman named Manfred Herbal, Mr. Biceps. I think Manfred had the biggest arms on the planet at the time, 26 inches, something like that, if I remember correctly, and had some great battles with Magnus Magnusson. Towards the end of the decade, we start to see the rise of Scandinavian legends. Sven Karlsson comes to mind. Maybe one of the best pound for pound deadlifters of all time, Yuko Ahola, who also went on to win the World's Strongest Man title. In the 2000s, the sport of strongman started to grow and fracture. A new federation came in called the International Federation of Strength Athletes, IFSA, and this caused the sport, at least at the top, to fracture. So, due to contracts, athletes had to either choose to keep participating in World's Strongest Man, or they needed to participate solely in the IFSA Strongman World Championships and associated contests there. And that meant that some of the top talent went to IFSA and some of it stayed in World's Strongest Man. So you kind of didn't get a true singular contest where all the best athletes were there for a number of years, just like there were the previous decades before. But this gave the opportunity for Mariusz Pudzianowski to dominate in the 2000s at the World's Strongest Man. He went on to win the title 5 times, which to date, he's the only man to win the title that number of times. So everyone else is still chasing him. Maybe Big Tom Stoltman or Mitch Hooper might get there, but we'll talk about them in a second. The 2000s were also the beginning of the careers of two of the biggest stars in modern strongman history, and that would be Big Z and Brian Shaw, who would go on to have one of the greatest rivalries in the last couple of decades as well. Big Z had his debut, I believe, in the 2008 World's Strongest Man. He would go on to win 4 World's Strongest Man titles, 8 Arnold Strongman Classic titles, and many, many world records. I think many would argue that Big Z is the greatest strongman of all time, and even if you don't agree with that, he's probably still the most decorated strongman with all of his accolades. I mean, the guy competed at the top levels of the sport for over a couple decades. Pretty impressive stuff. I encourage you to go check him out. But the other superstar who he went head to head with was Brian Shaw, who had arguably another amazing career. He would also win the World's Strongest Man title 4 times. I believe he won 3 Arnold Strongman Classic championship titles there, and also set a whole list of world records. At the end of the 2000s and into the 2010s, World's Strongest Man, Brian Shaw and Big Z would have another one of the greatest rivalries of the sport. I think between 2010 and 2016, the two of them would go back and forth winning the title for those 6 years. I got to watch that as it happened. It was pretty amazing. I encourage you to go check it out. Now, since 2016, the competitive landscape at World's Strongest Man has just kept growing and getting more and more challenging. We've actually seen the title switch hands quite a few times, which has been exciting. Always keeps people motivated. So in 2017, we saw Eddie Hall win the title. Eddie Hall is the first man to break the 500 kg deadlift barrier. In 2018, we see Hafthor Julius Bjornsson win his first World's Strongest Man title. And this is after many years of him being on the podium behind Big Z and Brian Shaw. So that was wonderful to see. And then in 2019 and 2020, Martins Licis and Alexei Novikov showed us that you don't have to be a big giant in order to win the title, which is very fascinating because until then, the guys had just been gaining more and more weight, more and more size. And now we see that the contest can be won by someone who's a bit smaller in stature. I mean, they're still giant people compared to the average, but not quite the 450-pound behemoths that predated them. So since then, we've seen the title go back and forth between Tom Stoltman, who's another giant of a man from Scotland, and the big Canuck Mitchell Hooper. And I think we're starting to see that the title isn't just won by, a singular, let's say body type of strongman. It actually is pushing all of these athletes to kind of diversify their skills and make sure that they're not only massive, but they're super fast and super strong. So I hope that gives you a little bit of background about the World's Strongest Man specifically. Why I spend so much time giving you this history is because this is where it all started. And I would argue because of the promoters and organization of this contest, we actually have the modern sport. So this brought together those first group of athletes, forced those athletes to start training for the specific types of feats of strength of the World's Strongest Man. And now we actually have, high level professional athletes. We have a sport with some kind of organization and rules. Could use a bit more funding, but we'll get there. It's been growing steadily ever since 1977. And, hopefully this video series might actually inspire you to become a fan, and that will just help the sport grow even more. The great news is that there have been lots of people who followed in the footsteps of those first World's Strongest Man promoters and went on to build more opportunities for athletes. In 2002, the Arnold Strongman Classic was born, driven by Dr. Terry and Jan Todd. The goal here was to become one of the most brutal challenges of strength that the athletes would see, and I think they've succeeded in doing that. The other great thing that they do at the Arnold Strongman Classic is bring in implements from the history of the sport. One example would be the guys today lift replicas of Louis Cyrs's famous dumbbells that he pressed overhead. So until 2020, the World's Strongest Man and the Arnold Strongman Classic were the two pinnacle contests of the sport, where their prestige was on par, debated a lot, but you'd often see that the best athletes in the world would be competing at the Arnold Strongman Classic and then go on to also compete for the World's Strongest Man title that same year. Since 2020, we've seen the creation of a few more contests that are now building up to that level of prestige, bringing in really good prize money, and drawing in the best athletes around the world. The first one there would be the Shaw Classic, which was created by Brian Shaw and has now awarded the title of the strongest man on earth. That contest is a wonderful contest, usually 8 events over 2 days, and it draws in usually 16 or more of the best athletes from around the world. The next one is the Magnus for Magnusson Strongman Classic, put on by World's Strongest Man, Magnus for Magnusson. And you got to check out this contest. Essentially, Magnus takes the guys to Iceland. It's November. They're out there in the snow. very unique implements, some very famous ones like the Husafelt stone carry. Anyways, it's a great time. But this is, rising to become one of the star competitions for the top level professional athletes. The last contest here is the Rogue Invitational. They've done a great job of bringing in and building some really amazing implements. Personally, I really love them because they do a great job of combining the wood and the steel. If you know me and my history of making equipment, you'll know how much I enjoy that. But it's risen to become another one of the top level contests. They bring together 10 of the best athletes in the world, and they also pay, I think, the highest prize money in the sport right now for a single competition. So, really great. All of these shows are just giving athletes more and more opportunities to become great, to put on great entertainment, and to hopefully make a little money doing the thing that they love. So, more good news is that over the last decade or so, the sport is becoming even more organized for amateurs or athletes of other classes. Now we have official strongman games, which is, like a top level contest for weight class athletes. There's natural strongman federations starting to pick up speed around the world, so that if you don't take a performance enhancing drugs, you want to be drug tested, there's those routes for you as well. There's way more contests for female athletes. There's even divisions for masters athletes, even masters 50 plus. We have kind of a world championship for now. So, you know, the sport has grown from this single contest in 1977 to something that resembles a modern sport where there's kind of organization, there's weight classes, there's lots of avenues for you to get into the sport and also excel at the sport in whatever form works best for you. Now, despite the growth of the sport, there still remains some big challenges that are just inherent to the sport. Probably most of them will not go away, or maybe nor should they, because they're just part of the sport at this point. But I want to spend the rest of this video discussing those 5 challenges. So, the first challenge I want to discuss is how training is really an underdetermined system. Underdetermined system here, I'm borrowing this term from mathematics. And in this discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about mathematics and biomechanics so you can understand what I mean by underdetermined system. So in mathematics, we have the concepts of equations and variables. Variables are describing aspects of your system, and equations describe the relationships between the variables. So to solve any scenario or system, we need to have the same number of equations and variables. If we have less equations than variables, which means we'd have a bunch of aspects of our system and not enough equations to describe the relationships between them, this means that there are an infinite number of solutions potentially, and this is what we would call an underdetermined system. Now, the good thing for us is that it means there's potentially an infinite number of solutions. That's how we're able to train and make progress and move towards our goals. However, if you're looking for an optimal solution inside of infinity, you can imagine how challenging that can be. So that's the main point here, is that training is an underdetermined system, which is what allows us, to move forward with approximations. But it's very difficult to determine optimal solutions. Even if you find an optimal solution for a given point in time, what's the likelihood that it's going to apply to even yourself in the future? And so hopefully you understand why that makes training so difficult. Now, I want to highlight just how underdetermined training is, or really even our understanding of motion is. So consider this equation here. This is a simple equation of a single joint motion. So imagine the elbow, for example. In this equation, we have a few terms. I here is the inertia of the limb segment, let's say your forearm moving about the elbow. Theta is the position of the elbow. And that describes basically the position of the joint. On the other side of the equation, we have a summation of the forces of the muscles acting on that joint. So just to summarize, on one side, we're describing the positions, and on the other side, we're describing the forces that are going to contribute to some motion. So I want to use this equation here just to highlight, even in the simple example of a single joint, there are too many unknowns to account for. For example, with the inertia, you see here it's a constant, but in the real world, this represents, your forearm and hand. Well, those things change shape as you move. And even at a smaller level, the blood flow changes, second to second as you move. So that means that this number wouldn't just be a single number, it would actually be dynamic and changing. Now, it might not change a lot, but it is going to change. So right away, this simple joint equation doesn't account for those dynamics. So on the other side, we have basically the summation of forces that are describing the resultant joint torque that we're going to get. Now, here on this side, we're saying we're basically aggregating the forces of all the different muscle fibers of a muscle into one group. And so we're really taking away the intricacies of those muscle forces. We're making things simplistic so that we can understand them easier, maybe approximate them. But there's a lot of intricacies that play into those muscular forces. So there's going to be chemical factors, there's going to be positional factors, so how stretched the muscle is when it starts applying this force. There's going to be electrical factors. The muscles are activated through the electrical signals, and clearly here they're not defined in this model. Okay, there's a few more aspects here I'd like to highlight about how underdetermined this system is. Let's look at this example here. So what you're seeing is a simple example using the equation that I just showed you before. But here we only are considering two muscles, the biceps and triceps, pulling back and forth on the elbow joint. Now, even in this simple example, we know that we're missing a lot of details here. First of all, we know that there's muscles that contribute to elbow joint motion that are not featured here. Okay, so that's a given. But even just in these two muscles, the biceps is actually a multi-joint muscle, so it spans the shoulder and the elbow, which means that the motion at the elbow is going to be affected by motion at the shoulder. With this simple example, that is unaccounted for. Again, here, every muscle, even these two, has musculotendon units that have different firing rates in terms of how they're activated. The recruitment patterns vary with the speed of the motion, the joint position, and the level of the fatigue. None of that is accounted for here. And finally, the number of fibers that's recruited for any particular motion or any amount of resistance also varies. So I hope, going through this mathematics and biomechanics here just shows you how much variability there is in the human system and how it often goes unaccounted for. When we discuss motion and training, we say, do a deadlift. And we may or may not know what that means. We could define it as a set of positions in space, but we're not defining it to the level even that I'm talking about here with mathematical equations. And we're definitely not going under the surface of the skin to account for all that variability. So that is, I just want you to know that if you're getting into training, and especially strongman training, it's a very underdetermined system. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on, and you don't have enough equations to describe the relationships between all the aspects of your body and the environment and the tasks that you need to do. Okay, so let's talk about the second challenge, which is the strongman skill pool. Now, it's honestly enormous, and I'm going to kind of break it down for you. But before I wrote Foundations of Strongman Training, there was no source that tried to document all of the strongman skills that an athlete needs to master. And even the one I provided does not have all the skills on it. For example, there's no mooring bit carry. I know that that's a skill. I've watched it in contests, but it's not on the list. So this set of strongman skills is, I think that the number of unique skills is actually bigger than any other sport in the world, with one exception, and that would be with mixed martial arts. Mixed martial arts is one avenue that might actually rival strongman in terms of the number of unique skills, because you have all these different martial arts and they all have their different techniques. So if you learn them all, it might be pretty similar to the demand on strongman athletes. However, you're not lifting nearly as heavy objects, which makes it kind of a unique challenge. But I think if you compare strongman to other strength sports, there's no comparison. In powerlifting, you have to learn or master 3 skills. Weightlifting is 2. Strongman is hundreds, which we'll get into more. Now, to highlight the size of the skill set, I wanted to go through a comparison here that I made in the Foundations of Strongman Training book. What you're seeing here is a table from the book that goes through this example, and it gives you an idea of the potential total skill set size. So let me take you through it here. I'm comparing in this example strongman to powerlifting and weightlifting. At the top, you'll see the tested skills. Those are the skills that are tested in competition. Now, as we'll discuss in a later episode, I think next episode, the number of tested movement patterns I found for amateur athletes was 74. In powerlifting, we have 3 movement patterns, and in weightlifting, we have 2. Okay. In terms of effort patterns, so that means how each skill is tested. In strongman, and we're going to talk about this later as well, there's at least 2 effort patterns that every skill can be tested on. So, for example, a deadlift can be tested for a 1 repetition max. It can also be tested for as many repetitions as possible. Okay, so there's others, but let's just say there's 2 on average in this example. In powerlifting, there's only a single effort pattern, which is maximal effort, and same with weightlifting. So you see here, in tested skills alone, we could have 148 for strongman. We have 3 for powerlifting and 2 for weightlifting. Okay, so that's just what happens in competition. But each of those skills needs to be built up, right? So let's account for those as well. And we'll call them builder skills. If we, break them down, and let's say that, skills are this combination of movement and effort patterns. So let's say that this is actually in training relatively the same. So for each tested skill, there's going to be 3 movement patterns and 2 effort patterns that you're going to need to master in order to build that individual skill. So let's say that gives you 6 builder skills for every tested skill. So now we just multiply these numbers out, and you can see that powerlifting has, in this example, 18 total skills that they need to master. Weightlifters can focus on 12, and strongman would have to consider 888 total skills. So I hope this example just shows you the potential skill set size difference between strongman and other, strength sports. Now, The good news is a lot of these skills have similarities to other skills, so you get carryover, and that's why an athlete, a strongman athlete, doesn't need to master 800 skills. They just need to master a certain set of those, but still, I would argue that that skill set is much larger than in the other two sports that we compared. Now, I hope that example highlights this demand that strongman places on athletes. Athletes are going to have to be considering hundreds of skills that they need to get exposed to, let alone master them. And for something like powerlifting, you have a much reduced set of skills that you have to consider. You could get even if you had a few variations for all three major lifts, it doesn't even come close to the number of tested skills that an athlete might see in competition, let alone all the building skills for each of those tested skills that they're going to need to master the technique so that they can, get the right stimulus in the gym and obviously have a good performance on game day. All right, let's move on to the third challenge here, which is skill uncertainty. So if the skill pool size didn't scare you, then let's talk about this next one here, which is uncertainty. So basically, uncertainty is the bedrock of the sport of strongman now. It's what it's been built on. And even to this day, athletes don't have details about what skills they're going to be tested on at the contest until sometimes till the day of. Some promoters have mystery events and it's put out there as you're not going to know until the day of the contest. Sometimes you don't know until just a few weeks before the contest. So you can imagine how difficult that is. So you're trying to find the optimal training solution to a set of unknown skills. Good luck. So that's why you need to kind of look at all the skills in the skill pool and try to get exposed and get good at all of them so that on the day you're ready for anything. So I have a contest coming up in about 3 months, and I think one of the events or two of them, the details are still not released for. So this is the commonplace in strongman, and it really forces you to just be kind of prepare as generally as possible. And if you do this long enough, eventually you'll be able to prepare, specifically because you will have touched a lot of the events over and over and over again. But what promoters do is often, let's say, 3-4 months before the contest, they'll release the event names. Now, a lot of times from the event names, you'll know the movement pattern. So it might say max deadlift. Okay, so I know it's a deadlift. I know it's for maximal effort, but you don't know the details. Is it a car deadlift? Is it on a stiff bar? Is it an axle? Is it an elevated deadlift? You have no idea until maybe closer to the contest, or maybe not even until the day of the contest. Other things you might not know are, say you have to do a farmer's walk. You don't know the length of the course. Should you train for a 50-foot walk or a 200-foot walk? Those are going to be, different, quite a bit different, how you approach them, but you won't know. You don't know the time limits. If there's an actual clean and press event, is it a 60-second timer or a 90-second timer? It's going to change how you train for those things. You might not know the weights at all, right? So that makes it very difficult. Should you push yourself or not, depending on what that weight might be? It's really hard in terms of how do you train for the sport when you don't know these details. You basically are optimizing for unknowns, which, as I mentioned, is pretty unreasonable thing to do. Best of luck to you. So if that wasn't challenging enough, the uncertainty here goes even deeper. Ever since I've been competing, and I remember I used to say this explicitly on the contest promotions, now it's more of an unwritten rule, but it's that events are subject to change day of contest. So you could be in the middle of your contest. The next event was supposed to be a max deadlift, and now it's something else. Now, there's good reasons for this. Mostly it's because equipment traditionally wasn't high quality, and also you're throwing typically these pieces of equipment around, so it's, there's a risk of them breaking. So basically, if an athlete goes and they drop an axle and it snaps, the promoter now has the opportunity to say, all right, let's swap this out with something else, and that any athletes who went before can wait till the end to go again on the new piece of equipment. So that way it doesn't ruin the entire contest, and that event can be changed and keep going. So there's good reasons, but it makes it like super difficult, right? So you might have trained for a max repetition car squat, and then on the day it changes to a max axle deadlift from a standard height. If that example seems oddly, specific, that's because I had to live through that one. What had happened was when the apparatus for the car squat was tested with a car, it weighed around 700 pounds. And then on the day of the contest, the sponsor who was, sending the car to be used, that original car was tested on wasn't available. So they sent a different car that was way heavier. The scale ended up saying around 1,000 pound squat, which was too heavy for that pool of athletes, maybe too heavy in general. And so it was switched to that max axle deadlift event. So I hope that emphasizes just the level of uncertainty there is in this sport. You don't know the contest details until, probably close to the event. And even if you know them, you have to be prepared for them to change on the day of the contest. Not putting contest details out there, it might seem like a lack of planning on the promoter's parts. Sometimes it probably is. Sometimes they're waiting for equipment to be made, for example, and they don't know if it's going to work, so they don't want to commit to using it. But honestly, some of it is just that the sport is now has this idea ingrained to it that just be ready for anything. So when you're training, yeah, you should spend most of your time on those 5 skills that you're going to be tested on, but you also have hundreds of other skills that might just pop up out of nowhere, and you better be ready for them as well. It's not, I would argue, it's not very good for entertainment value, because if you know what you're going to be tested on, like for example, powerlifting, you know exactly how the lifts are going to go. You'll be able to maximize your performance on those because you don't have to account for this variability. All of your resources can be put into that. So I would say it's lack of details or uncertainty isn't very great for the entertainment value, and it's also not great for injury risk. If you have to put on a maximum performance on some event that you haven't touched ever, there's a lot higher injury risk than if you had 20 weeks of training exactly with that implement, trying different techniques and honing it in and everything. So, but that's part of the sport. There's uncertainty, and you just got to get used to it and account for it. Okay, challenge number 4. This is about effort patterns. It's related to number 2. We talked, mostly about motion patterns. I mentioned effort patterns, but if that skill pool wasn't big enough, it's about to get even bigger. So just to refresh, skills are this combination of motion patterns and effort patterns. Essentially the motion patterns define the positions and the effort patterns define the forces or how to move between those positions, whether it's the athlete, the object, or both. So the skill pool example I showed mentioned that there were 2 types of effort patterns for every strongman, motion pattern for each skill that would be tested. However, that's not true. And as I describe in the book, there's actually more effort patterns than just 2. So, for example, the deadlift in strongman can be tested for a 1 repetition max, a maximum effort, a repeated effort where you do as many repetitions as possible. It can be held in the hands for the longest time, or it can be part of a medley where you have to do a series of deadlifts or deadlifts plus other skills in the fastest amount of time possible. So right there, that's 4 effort patterns for that 1 movement pattern. Again, comparing to powerlifting, it's only a single effort pattern. It's a deadlift and it's a maximum effort. So I hope you can see that, you see the example where there were 74 motion patterns. Now imagine each one of those skills has 4 effort patterns associated with them instead of 2. So you obviously double the amount of skills or potential skill set that athletes are going to have to be, ready for that might show up in contests. Another way I want to emphasize this is to use the force velocity curve for human muscle. So you see here's the force velocity curve. Now keep in mind, this is a generalized version that I'm showing you. But what you'll see is that force is maximized at zero or near zero velocity, while force is minimized at the highest velocities. I've also overlaid here different types of effort patterns that help illustrate the range of demands on strongman athletes. Now, anyone is going to benefit from training across the largest portion of this force velocity curve as possible, but not everyone is tested on it. Only strongmen are. And so that's what I want to highlight here. So the breadth of different force patterns that strongmen are tested on in competition is, I think, bigger than any other sport, at least any other strength sport. Okay, so let's get into the last of our 5 challenges here. Number 5, the competition schedule. Now, one can argue that skills aren't mastered until they're performed optimally under competition settings. Nobody cares about how many touchdowns you threw in the backyard, right? So that's basically means that you can train all the skills all you want in the gym, but we wouldn't consider you a master of them until you demonstrate that in a competition setting, right? Now, the difficulty with strongman is that no 2 contests are the same. Even if they have the same events, there's lots of different, like say they have the same movement patterns in the same order, there's lots of other variables that can still change that make no 2 contests the same. And this is way different than other sports. For example, in football, the rules are always the same. The size of the field's always the same. The number of players is the same. The play clock's the same, right? In strongman, the events aren't the same. Even if the motion patterns are, often they're tested as different effort patterns. The implements are different, right? There's no standardization. The floor is different. Sometimes you're indoors in a gym, sometimes you're in the park, and also the rules are different. So one promoter might, tell you that you have 60 seconds for this event, and the next one tells you have 90 seconds for the same event. So that makes it very difficult, right? When every time you go into a contest, it's something new, and you have to prepare for all of that variability. And also, you're not going to be a master of that skill until you demonstrate it at contests, potentially multiple contests. So what that means is that athletes need a way bigger breadth of competitive experience. For example, I have been competing for 13 years. I've never pulled a plane, done a block press, or a mooring bit carry in any competition that I've done. I've done a lot of them, but those things just haven't come up. And that would be just to do them one time. Now, if I want to say I'm good at it or great at it, I've mastered it, how many contests would I need to do that in before I could say that? It'd probably take me at least a few with each of those, kind of skills. So this leads athletes to thinking that they should compete all the time. And maybe in some cases they should, but you should know that there's a trade-off here. And this is what the last challenge is all about. You can compete 20 times a year, but then you're going to have 20 preparation, blocks before each contest. And you're going to have 20 recovery blocks after each contest. And so, what's left over in terms of time for training and getting stronger? The other thing is, when you compete that often, is you increase the injury risk. As we'll discuss in a later video, the injury risk in strongman is one of the highest of all the strength sports. It's probably likely that if you compete 20 times in a year, you're going to have a bunch of injuries. Even if they're not major, they're going to be things that are holding you back. And every time you get an injury, you push yourself backwards away from your goals, right? Some of them might just be for a week or two. Some injuries are career ending potentially. And so that's where you need to analyze this trade off between how much I should compete to reach my goals and how little I should compete to make sure that I'm recovering enough, that I'm reducing my injury risk, and that I actually have time to train in between each contest to get stronger. The other thing for athletes to consider with the, choosing this competitive schedule, so you might want to train a lot, but it has other costs as well, like financial costs and time costs. So even most of the professional athletes have a job still, right? There's not enough money in the sport quite yet, where maybe the top few are able to be just strongmen, but often people have families and work and everything else. So if you want to compete 20 times a year, do you have the financial stability to do that? Can you take time off work every other weekend to go to contests because you got the travel time, you're staying, everything. Financially, it's going to add up a lot. Most people likely don't have a job that can afford them to do these things. Take time off work all the time just to go compete. So that's what you're going to have to consider, and that's what makes this sport challenging. You know, to be good, at least quickly, you need to do a lot of competition. So you're exposed to lots of skills. But there's all these constraints on your time, financials, the injury risk of it. And so, how do you balance these things? That becomes a big challenge for the sport on how to train optimally and peak optimally for performing at those contests. Hopefully, achieving the goals you set out to achieve. Okay, I hope I didn't scare you away from the sport of strongman, but I just really wanted you to be informed on the big challenges that there are in this sport. Nobody told me about these challenges when I started, and that's why I want to share them with you because they're big, they're a lot to consider, there's a lot of variability going on there, and it's best that you have this knowledge going into it, so that you can, hopefully get to where you want to go faster and hopefully with less injuries. What's really great about strongman or even just training like strongmen do is the variety. The variety, when you get into competing, the variety is maybe a pain in the ass because you have a lot of things you need to prepare for. But if you're just training for strongman, you're enjoying it, it's wonderful because it means like every session or every training block, there can be a whole bunch of new skills or variation on skills that you can train, and it becomes very fun. You don't get stagnant because you can always choose something else because it fits within the sport, and all of them are difficult. The other thing that does is it really helps build a strong mind, strong mindset, because you have all this variability, and you have to be prepared for it all. You can't just get stuck on one thing. Your maximum deadlift didn't go well that day, let's say. Well, you have three other skills you need to train that day, and then next week it's deadlift for maximum repetitions, and so you can't just get hung up on that. You have things to do. You have so many skills to prepare for that you just got to keep going, on and on and on. So as much fun as this sport is, it can be just downright brutal. You come out of a contest and you need weeks to recover. You might even get sick after, almost like a competition flu, because you put so much stress on your body in such a short period of time. And that's why, for most people, you should look at this as a long term endeavor. If you try to cram a whole bunch of competitions in your first season, you might be able to get away with it, but you also might end your career before you actually reach your potential because it's just so much on your body, and you might not have built up the mindset to withstand something like that. So, most athletes, this is like a multi year endeavor. Probably I'd set aside like a decade if you really want to get to the peak of your performance, and you want to do it in a way that minimizes injury risk, and it still is fun, and you can like sustain it with all the rest of the things going on in your life. You should really think about it on like a long term kind of scale. But something for you to keep in mind is you don't have to master all of the skills. You just have to be better at the ones you're tested on than your competitors are. So that also adds a bit of strategy into the sport, right? Um, as I kind of showed you, there's potentially hundreds of skills to master. You're going to have to, get pretty good at a lot of those, but you need to keep an eye on your competition, right? You just have to be better than them in order to win on that day. So, in conclusion, I hope you have a good idea now, a brief history about the sport of strongman, where it came from, some of the big names and rivalries that happened throughout the years, some of the big contests that we now have that you can go watch and support the athletes. And I hope also now you understand the big challenges that come along with the sport and training for the sport. And I'd love to know, what do you find as the most challenging aspects of training for strongman or competing for strongman? Let me know in the comments. Love to hear about it. In the next episode, I'm going to dive into the first fundamental question, which is, which strongman skills should strongman athletes master? Here we talked about kind of the size of the skill pool. I mentioned I found some for amateurs. So I'm going to dive into that a bit more. There's a study that I did along with this, so we'll go into the details of that and then hopefully get some insights from that you can apply to your strongman training. All right, thanks for watching. Take care.